Imagine a smiling man dressed as a clown, entertaining innocent children at birthday parties. Now imagine that behind that painted face hid one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history. John Wayne Gacy wasn't just a criminal. He was the twisted portrait of what society insists on calling normalcy. But the true horror didn't begin with the bodies. It began long before, inside the mind of a man in conflict. A man torn between the mask the world could see and the abyss he refused to face. In this video, we are going to cross that abyss. We will look at Gacy through the deep, relentless lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, to uncover the unconscious motives, the carefully crafted personas, the denied desires, and the wild shadow that ultimately took over. Prepare yourself for a dark journey into the human mind, where sanity is just a performance, and the true face hides in the dark. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share it with those who love deep psychology and true crime, and leave your thoughts in the comments at the end. In this video, surprising revelations will expose how evil can wear a smile. After this, you'll never look at normality the same way again. John Wayne Gacy was the textbook example of a respectable citizen, a local entrepreneur, an active political figure, a community event organizer, a man who would dress up as a clown voluntarily to cheer up sick children in hospitals, a father, a friend, a neighbor everyone thought they could trust. But behind that respected figure, something was writhing, a psychic presence left unintegrated, something Carl Jung would call the shadow, the rejected part of the self, pushed down into the basement of the unconscious until one day it takes control. Gacy was responsible for the brutal murders of at least 33 young men and boys. He buried their bodies in the crawl space under his house, a true underground graveyard of the psyche. But the question that refuses to go away is, how could someone so seemingly ordinary, so functional, become a symbol of absolute evil? The answer doesn't lie solely in criminology. It lies in the internal structure of the human soul. According to Jung, every human being carries a duality: the persona, the face we present to the world, and the shadow. Everything we repress because it doesn't fit into society's expectations. Gacy's persona was flawless. He knew exactly how to perform the role of the ideal man, successful, charismatic, deeply involved in the community. But that role was so rigid, so meticulously built, that it hid a monstrous repression underneath. The more someone clings to an idealized persona, the more violent the shadow becomes when it breaks free. And in Gacy's case, it erupted as a devastating force. This extreme split reveals what Jung described as the danger of internal dissociation. When the persona no longer communicates with the shadow, when the process of individuation is blocked, the result is catastrophic. The repressed psychic energy returns like an internal demon, seeking manifestation in the external world. In Gacy's case, that manifestation took the form of absolute control, domination, and murder. Each crime wasn't just an act of violence. It was a symbolic performance of total power over another being, the inflated ego crushing the vulnerability of others. But there's something even more unsettling. Gacy showed almost no remorse. He was able to compartmentalize his life in a nearly superhuman way. This reveals another Jungian concept: projection. Everything he rejected within himself, vulnerability, homoerotic desire, deep insecurity, was projected onto his victims, and then annihilated. He wasn't just killing bodies. He was killing parts of himself, parts he couldn't bear to accept. This is where psychology and philosophy collide. Evil often doesn't arise from an active desire to destroy. It grows from the refusal to integrate who we really are. Gacy lived under the illusion of sanity, hidden behind a carefully painted mask of normalcy. But inside him, psychic chaos grew silently. until it devoured everything. The real question is, how many Gacys are out there, simply undiscovered? The shadow, when denied, seeps into the darkest corners of existence, and the more socially accepted someone is, the more terrifying it becomes when the shadow finally surfaces. The story of John Wayne Gacy is not just about murder. It's about the collapse of the human psyche when we chronically deny ourselves. It's about the horror of looking in the mirror and not recognizing the reflection on the surface. John Wayne Gacy, a volunteer artist, was known for his character Pogo the Clown. But in Carl Jung's analytical psychology, the clown is not merely a comedic symbol. It's an ambiguous archetype, deeply rooted in the collective unconscious. He laughs, but his laughter carries something tragic. He entertains, but his presence is always a little unsettling. The clown, like the trickster, is the mediator between order and chaos, and in Gacy, this mediator was completely possessed by the shadow. The figure of Pogo was more than just a disguise. It was a symbolic ritual, a performance of the duality of the psyche. The painted face, the colorful costume, the forced smile, all of it concealed the gaze of someone who had lost contact with their own psychic center. As Jung stated, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And Gacy, in his version of Pogo shone only to hide the abyss. Why does the clown archetype disturb us so much? Because it represents the paradox. It is both laughter and agony, innocence and threat. Gacy, by embodying this image, materialized the collective shadow of a society that prefers to smile rather than confront its own latent evil. But don't be deceived. Gacy was not a mere out-of-control psychopath. He was cold, methodical, capable of maintaining a double life with precision. And this is where another key Jungian concept comes in, the interrupted process of individuation. According to Jung, a healthy individual moves toward integration, that is, the recognition and assimilation of all parts of their being, including their dark impulses. But Gacy repressed. And what is repressed in the unconscious does not disappear. It merely changes form. Each of Gacy's victims, young, many of them vulnerable, represented a shattered mirror of his fragmented identity. There was a desire for submission and power, but also a rage against what he saw as unacceptable in himself. His repressed sexuality, his sense of inferiority, his need for total control. These young victims were, at their core, projections of Gacy's own soul, rejected parts that he needed to annihilate to sustain the illusion of sanity. This brings us to another crucial point: society's role in creating these monsters. Gacy was abused as a child. He grew up under the figure of an authoritarian father who ridiculed him and repressed his feelings. Gacy's shadow was nurtured in childhood, in silence, humiliation, the fear of not being enough. Jung said, "No tree grows to heaven without its roots touching hell." Gacy could never grow. He was dragged by roots infested with pain, shame, and darkness. And instead of integrating them, he chose to bury them, literally. But the bodies return. The shadow comes back. What makes this story even more terrifying is not the brutal acts themselves, but Gacy's ability to dissociate between what he did and what he believed himself to be. Gacy's persona continued to function perfectly in public, even as his inner life transformed into a symbolic cemetery. This shows that apparent sanity can be a carefully cultivated illusion, a thin veneer over chaos. The story of John Wayne Gacy forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many masks like his do we see every day? How many smiles hide an internal scream? In the next part, we'll explore the symbolism of Gacy's house, the place where the crimes occurred, as a representation of the personal unconscious, transformed into a psychic prison. Prepare to dive into the inner labyrinth of a man who lived between locked rooms, dark basements, and unheard voices. John Wayne Gacy's home was not just a crime scene, it was a symbolic manifestation of his imprisoned unconscious. Every corner, every wall, every layer of concrete poured to cover bodies in the basement was like a desperate attempt to silence what was screaming inside him. In Carl Jung's psychology, the house is a recurring metaphor for the psyche. The ground floor represents the conscious, daily life, the persona we present to the world. The basement is the deep unconscious, where repressed memories, traumas, and denied desires live. It is where the shadow resides, and Gacy made the basement of his house a sanctuary of death. There, he buried not only bodies, but parts of himself he refused to confront. This basement was not just physical, it was psychological. The crimes committed there were not just for sexual purposes or sadic. They were symbolic rituals. In each young man dominated, there was a performance of power. But paradoxically, this power was not a sign of strength. It was a cry of impotence. It was the attempt of someone deeply fragmented to restore control over a collapsing inner world. Each crime was a dramatization of the very collapse of identity. And here comes another crucial Jungian concept, the inflation of the ego. When the ego disconnects from the self, the unifying center of the psyche, it becomes tyrannical. It demands absolute control. And any impulse or emotion that threatens this control is destroyed. Gacy could not handle his own impulses. He needed to exterminate them in others, and the house then becomes the psychic theater of fragmentation. On the outside, it was a common, well-kept house, typical of an American suburb. But on the inside, it was a labyrinth of horrors, a precise metaphor for what happens when the shadow is not faced with courage. This leads us to an even darker point, the role of collectivity. Gacy did not exist in a vacuum. He was part of a system. He was heard by authorities, admired by neighbors, promoted in political campaigns. Jung spoke of the collective shadow, that part of the psyche that society as a whole prefers to ignore. Gacy was, in a way, the embodiment of this shadow. He showed with his actions what happens when everyone decides to pretend that everything is fine, even when the screams are coming from the basement. Modern society creates personas of success, happiness, and perfection. But where is the space for pain, for deviations, for internal suffering? By denying this within itself, society risks creating potential Gacys, men who learn to lie to themselves from a very young age. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires the courage to face the ugliest aspects of the soul. But who teaches this? Who prepares us to dialogue with fear, anger, desire, and chaos? Most prefer to flee. And like Gacy, they create a beautiful stage to hide the horror backstage. John Wayne Gacy ended his days on death row, proclaiming his innocence until the end. A man who killed dozens but never fully confessed to himself. And this is where Carl Jung's analysis hits its most painful point. Refusing to recognize the shadow does not dissolve it. It only gives it more power. Gacy was a prisoner, not of the system, but of himself. The one who never saw himself fully, who never accepted his impulses, who never looked in the mirror without the mask of the persona. He wasn't just a criminal, he was the tragic portrait of a man who had lost connection with his own soul. Jung saw the persona, this social facade we all wear, as necessary but dangerous. Because when we identify too much with it, we forget who we truly are. And the shadow grows. It becomes hungry. It wants to be seen, recognized, integrated. When this doesn't happen, it takes control. And that's exactly what Gacy experienced. The shadow, in its most radical state, is not just A collection of negative impulses. It is the unlived potential, distorted by fear. In Gacy, perhaps there was the artist, the sensitive man, the wounded soul seeking affection. But unable to accept his own vulnerability, he chose to mask it with domination. And each act of violence was a message. I am not weak. But deep down, he was. Jung said that true evil is not in those who recognize their faults, but in those who deny the evil within themselves and project it onto others. Gacy saw his impulses as something external, something to be destroyed. That's why he had to kill. He didn't kill for pleasure, but out of psychic despair, an unconscious impulse to try to heal by annihilating the other. This is one of the darkest truths of the human soul. Many monsters were born from untreated wounds, and instead of healing, they sought control. Instead of integration, they sought power. Instead of looking inward, they pointed outward. And if this seems distant from us, think carefully. How many times have you yourself hidden parts of who you are out of fear of rejection? How many times have you pretended to be someone else, just to maintain external order while your soul bled inside? Gacy's story shocks us, but it also mirrors us in an exaggerated way, yes, but still real. The difference between the ordinary man and the monster is not just in the act, but in the ability to recognize one's own abysses and refuse to be dominated by them. Jung said that the process of individuation requires a descent into the personal hell, a confrontation with the darkest parts of ourselves, not to glorify evil, but to understand it, tame it, integrate it. The human soul does not heal through denial, it heals through awareness. If Gacy had been taught to embrace his wounds, to look at his pain, to live his sexuality with dignity and self-knowledge, who knows what story we'd be telling here? But he wasn't. And that's why this story matters, because when we look at Gacy, we should not only see him as a monster, we should see him as a flashing red light on the edge of humanity's psychic road, a brutal reminder of what happens when the soul suffers in silence. And what would Jung see in this case in the light of the contemporary collective psyche? He would see a society increasingly disconnected from itself, a world that values appearance but neglects the inner world. A culture that avoids silence, introspection, and internal confrontation, and in this void, the shadow grows. Gacy was an extreme, but the signs are everywhere. Passive violence that corrodes relationships, explosions of anger that mask fragility, narcissism that screams for validation, and an ever-growing emotional disconnect between parents and children, between couples, between individuals and their own emotions. What we see outside is often a reflection of what is silent. Inside, it's not about justifying evil nor trivializing it. It's about understanding that there's a hidden complexity beneath the surface of what we call normality. We live in an era where the excess of stimuli pulls us away from the essential, the inner silence, the deep listening, the acceptance of our own imperfections. And in this constant noise, the shadow finds shelter. Carl Jung didn't propose we face evil with fury or repression, but with awareness, with the courage to look into the mirror, not to judge, but to understand. Not to condemn ourselves, but to integrate, because true strength is not in denying the abyss. It's in learning to walk along its edge without falling. Gacy's story is a painful reminder of what happens when the soul fractures, when the ego dominates the self, and when the mask becomes more real than the face. But it is also an invitation to reflect on what we are cultivating in our culture, in our relationships, and within ourselves. It's not about fearing the dark. It's about turning on lights where there has been silence for so long, where there has been forgetfulness for so long. If there's one thing we can take from this dark journey, it's that sanity is not always what it seems. And sometimes the greatest act of humanity is simply to stop, breathe, and allow ourselves to feel, even if it hurts. Because only then can we heal what the unconscious has been trying to tell us for so long. If you found this content important, share it. Comment on what impacted you the most, and subscribe to dive even deeper into the psychology of the human soul. In the next videos, we'll explore more stories, real, brutal, human, always through Carl Jung's deep lens, with the commitment to never trivialize pain nor the complexity of being.